Does somebody want to volunteer to video record?
My hands are full.
Sure.
Okay. I believe it is in fact now recording, so just hold it up.
Oh, awesome. All right.
Yeah, okay, so for those of you who don't know me, yes, I'm Frank. I graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law in 2014. I did First Amendment and due process law for a year, and now I'm not doing law, which leads into slide number 1. Yes, I'm not your lawyer. I'm not even a lawyer anymore. So nothing that you say to me is privileged. Nothing that I say to you is legal advice. So if you killed someone last night, don't tell me because I'd have to report it.
Well, I think that's 2 days ago.
Yeah. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about Trinity, Lutheran versus Pauley. It's a case the Supreme Court of the United States has agreed to hear. So presumably they're going to hear it sometime in the fall, although depending how the politics of it plays out, it would not surprise me if they postpone it until there's a new justice in place. We'll see what happens. Caitlin asked me at dinner how I thought it would come out, and I said it depends on who gets Justice Scalia's seat. So, yeah. So I'm going to start by talking about the background of the relevant legal provisions, and then go into the Trinity Lutheran case. So the first of the legal provisions is the Establishment Clause. That's this one up here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. It's in the First Amendment. So the establishments that the founders were thinking of when they wrote that were thinking mostly of the Church of England and of these Congregationalist establishments in New England. So what those establishments looked like was you had government control of the clergy and of doctrine. So the doctrines of the Church of England are adopted by the British Parliament, by the political body. Their bishops are appointed by the government, and their bishops in turn sit in the House of Lords, which is the upper house of the British Parliament. So there's a lot of intermingling there. Queen Elizabeth is today the head of the Church of England. She's a religious figure as well as a political one. So that's that intermingling of government and religious hierarchy is one of the features of an establishment. Another big feature is compelled attendance, or at least financial support of the established church. Most Europeans pay taxes that support the established churches in Europe. In the American colonies, the colonists were paying taxes to support, to pay the salaries of their ministers, to pay for building and maintaining the churches where they worshipped. And then establishments also often involve suppression to one degree or another of faiths different from the established one. And that can range from executing any heretics that you find to much more mild things. For a while in England, Catholics could not be members of professions. They could not be lawyers, but they were not going to be locked up for being Catholic. So that the degree to which suppression happens can vary. But that's the kind of establishment that the founders were thinking of when they wrote the Establishment Clause. And when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, that's one of the things that he felt was important enough to put on his gravestone, along with UVA and the Declaration of Independence. This is one of the quotes from it. It says, "To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical." So that's the evil that Jefferson was thinking about. So these were kinds of laws that specifically set up a particular religion as a beneficiary of government support in one way or another. They were laws that were written to target religion. The cases that we see today, like Trinity Lutheran, are much more often cases where the government is giving some generalized benefit and religion of one kind or another wants to participate in. The founders weren't thinking about that question simply because the federal government, which was the only one that the Establishment Clause applied to when it was written, wasn't in the business of giving a lot of benefits to private organizations, certainly not private organizations for which there were religious versions. The Establishment Clause did not begin to apply to the federal government or to the state and local governments until the middle of the 20th century. So for most of American history, the states were free to do whatever they wanted in terms of supporting or not supporting religion. And in fact, some of the states kept their established churches into the 1830s. And when they disestablished them, that was a choice of the state government. Nobody thought that the federal Constitution required them to disestablish their churches. So that's what's going on in the 18th century. Any questions about any of that? Okay. Yes?
When you said about people having to pay in Europe to sustain them, is that still applied nowadays, or?
It varies somewhat by country. Some countries will have an opt-out, but still have a default of you pay taxes to support some church. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the established churches are still being financed by government collected tax money. And again, if you visit the British House of Lords today, you will see the bishops of the Church of England sitting there. That's one of the things that they do. Yeah. So the 19th century religion controversies are what lead to the Blaine Amendments, which is what's at issue in the Trinity Lutheran versus Pauley case. So the 19th century, there were a lot of conflicts about what happened with religion in the public schools. Now, the public schools of the 19th century were not the more or less secular things that we all went to. Public schools did not become secular until the Supreme Court started getting involved in applying the Establishment Clause in the middle of the 20th century. So in the 19th century, the public schools were mostly set up to be what they called non-sectarian, which meant generic Protestant. When they said non-sectarian, they meant these were not Lutheran schools, these were not Methodist schools, these were not Presbyterian schools, these were generic Protestant schools. But they were, the purpose that at least Protestants saw them as serving was to inculcate moral values, which they saw as coming from specifically the King James Version of the Bible, to teach people to read the King James Bible. And so in these public schools, they had daily readings from the King James Bible. They had daily recitations of the Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer, and the versions of them that are in the King James Bible. They had Protestant hymns being sung. And they had corporal punishment. This was 19th century America. It was seen as perfectly acceptable for adults to hit kids. So if kids didn't participate in this, their teachers would beat them. So that's what the public schools looked like in 19th century America. So it's not enormously surprising that the Catholics of that time period did not want to send their children there. The Protestants, of course, saw all this as neutral in some sense, as promoting moral values. Protestants saw subordination to the Pope as being undemocratic. So they were not very sympathetic to the situation of the children of Catholic parents. The Catholics of this time period, they had their own translation of the Bible, different version of the Ten Commandments, different version of the Lord's Prayer. And their Bible had a lot of notes and comments from the church hierarchy printed in it, because this is one of the big differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. In Protestantism, lay people are supposed to be able to read and interpret the Bible for themselves. In Catholicism, the church is supposed to be an intermediary between the lay people and God. The church is supposed to be the authority in interpreting the Bible. Catholics, especially then, did not see lay people of any age as being competent to interpret the Bible for themselves. So the Catholic children were not willing to, or often refused to participate in these religious exercises, and then you have beatings, you have people being suspended and expelled, and this leads to a lot of conflict. It leads to the Catholics demanding that they get their share of the tax money that supports schools to support the Catholic schools that they were setting up. This leads to a lot, in some cases, rioting, violence. In 1844 in Philadelphia, there was a lot of rioting. Whole city blocks were burned. About 20 people were killed fighting over this issue. So this was a big sort of conflict that was happening. The Catholics, for the most part, did not end up getting any money from the government to support the Catholic schools, but they still set up quite a few of them, which is why there are still a lot of Catholic schools in this country today. Yes?
What about in like areas of New England that were predominantly Catholic? Like Rhode Island, or like, I know that you didn't have as many of the like newer immigrants that, most of the newer immigrants are Catholic, but like, I thought Rhode Island was specifically set up for Catholics.
Yeah, that is true, Rhode Island.
I don't know of any other.
Yeah, I don't know Rhode Island history specifically on this point. The cases that I've read a lot about on this point are from places like Philadelphia and New York, where you're dealing with more recent Irish Catholic immigrants. So I don't know the Rhode Island case specifically. Any other questions at this stage? Okay. So what came out of this were Blaine amendments. The one I quoted up here is from the Missouri Constitution, is the one that's at issue in Trinity Lutheran versus Pauley. It says that no money shall ever be taken from the public treasury, directly or indirectly, in aid of any church, sect, or denomination of religion, or in aid of any priest, preacher, minister, or teacher thereof as such. That's in the Missouri Bill of Rights. There are similar provisions in 37 state constitutions. The shaded states on the map are the ones that have Blaine amendments. The ones that are not shaded are the ones that don't. So this is most of the country that has these in their state constitutions. Any questions about that? Yes?
Does the as such apply to the priest, preacher, minister, and to the church, sect, denomination, blah, blah, blah? Or does it just apply to priest, preacher, etc.? What's the scope of the as such? Because that's kind of important, I guess.
Now, I think the sentence is grammatically ambiguous. I do not know Missouri case law on this particular point.
Okay.
That particular question is not addressed in any of the court opinions or cert stage briefs in the Supreme Court on this case, and I have not read enough Missouri Supreme Court opinions to know exactly how they would be interpreted.
Okay.
It's ambiguous. It's a good question. Okay, so Trinity Lutheran is a church. They operate a daycare, it's a pre-K level daycare, and this is from their own complaint. So this is how the church itself describes what it's doing. It says the Learning Center is a ministry of the church, incorporates daily religion and developmentally appropriate activities into a school and optional daycare program. Through the Learning Center, the church teaches a Christian worldview to children of members of the church, as well as children of non-member residents of Boone County and the surrounding area. The church has a sincere religious belief to be associated with the Learning Center and to use it to teach the gospel to children of its members, as well as to bring the gospel message to non-members. So they see the role of their daycare, their preschool, as teaching the Christian religion to these very young children. That's what they're trying to do. Missouri operates a program where they tax purchases of new tires, and they use the money to give grants to pave playgrounds with rubbery material made from used tires. They give, in the particular year the Trinity Lutheran applied for one of these grants, there were 14 grants given. The state ranked the 44 applicants, and Trinity Lutheran ranked 5th out of the 44 applicants. So on these criterion that don't look at religion, there is no dispute that Trinity Lutheran easily qualified to receive a grant. Missouri denied Trinity Lutheran a grant specifically because Trinity Lutheran is a church. They specifically cited the Blaine Amendment that I had up a couple of slides ago. So there's also no dispute that the reason that Trinity Lutheran did not receive a grant is because it's a church rather than some other kind of preschool. Any questions so far on anything? Okay, cool. Yeah. So, as many of you know, I give a whole presentation on the free exercise clause and related statutes. I'm not going to go through all that doctrine today. But what probably the biggest argument that Trinity Lutheran is making is that the denial of this application violates the free exercise clause of the United States Constitution, because the Blaine Amendment, on its face, if you just read the text of the Blaine Amendment, you can see it is looking specifically at whether the recipient of the money is a religious organization and making a determination based on that. And that is, at least according to Trinity Lutheran, that is discrimination that is forbidden by the free exercise clause. Trinity Lutheran makes the argument that the Blaine Amendments originated as a form of anti-Catholic bigotry and are therefore invalid. Missouri responds to that by, Missouri essentially rewrote its entire constitution in 1945. Missouri says in one of its briefs that there was no anti-Catholic bigotry in 1945. I'm very curious what's going to happen when they submit merits briefs, and the church has an opportunity to do its historical research and see what it can find about what happened in 1945. I don't really know what's going to come out of that, but it'll be an interesting question. And then the general issues with giving money to religious organizations. Missouri is making the argument that to give Trinity Lutheran money, it had to deny money to someone else, and that therefore it's not wrong for them to deny Trinity Lutheran money. So they're giving it to someone else who is presumably worthy. And there's always the issue that money is fungible. You know, if Trinity Lutheran doesn't have to spend money on the surface for its playground, it has that money to then do something else with, to hire another minister, to buy new hymn books, you know, whatever religious activity that it wants to spend that money on, and the state is not supposed to be providing money for churches to do religious things. So that's the kind of free exercise argument that's going on there. There's also the anti-establishment argument. The big part of the state's argument in this case is that it's got this anti-establishment interest. It's interested in not having an established religion, and that justifies denying funding even if that would otherwise be an issue under the free exercise clause. So the case that everyone is arguing about for the most part is Locke versus Pauley. This is a 2004 Supreme Court case where the state of Washington was giving out scholarships to pretty much all college students below a certain income threshold, and it specifically excluded from the scholarships a guy who was pursuing a theology degree with the intent of becoming a minister. The Supreme Court said that it was permissible for Washington to exclude this individual from the scholarship program because of the interest in avoiding looking like these historical establishments of religion. Supporting the clergy was one of the big things that happened in establishments of religion, and so the state of Washington had an interest that the Supreme Court found acceptably strong in not supporting a future clergyman. And that's what happened in Locke versus Davey. Trinity Lutheran makes the argument that their case doesn't have the same anti-establishment interest going on. They're not asking for money for the support of clergy. They are trying to make out the playground as being a secular sort of enterprise. Certainly there are many non-churches that have playgrounds. They have a secular function, though who knows whether the particular playground at this church is having prayers led on it or whatever else. Who knows how the church is doing it. Because of the procedural way that the case developed, there hasn't been much opportunity to develop evidence on that particular point. Really, there hasn't been much opportunity to develop evidence on any particular point. So that's the argument that Trinity Lutheran is making. Missouri, of course, argues that the other big use of tax money in traditional establishments of religion was to build houses of worship, to provide the facilities where the religious activity took place. And this looks like that. This grant was being requested to contribute to building a facility where worship happens, where children are taught religion. And that, according to Missouri, does look a lot like the traditional establishments that they are permitted to try to avoid. The other case that's been cited is McDaniel versus Patty. This was not a funding case, but it does play the same free exercise, non-discrimination sort of argument against historic anti-establishment issues. So what happened in McDaniel versus Patty was the state of Tennessee had a clause in its constitution that said that members of the clergy were not allowed to sit in the state legislature. A clergy person challenged that, and the Supreme Court said that that was unconstitutional. You have to permit clergy, if they win through the political process, to sit in the state legislature. Denying them that is discriminating against religion, even though that does start to look a little bit like the historic establishments of religion. You know, as I said, the bishops of the Church of England sit in the British Parliament. That is the sort of thing that the Establishment Clause is meant to try to avoid. So that's the other case that's being cited here. So that's the precedent. That's the basic sort of arguments that are being made in this case. Are there any questions at this point? Anyone? Okay. I'll move on. Bigger picture, what are the implications of this case? So the fears that are being expressed by Trinity Lutheran and by the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is the advocacy organization representing Trinity Lutheran. It's one of the biggest evangelical Christian legal organizations in the country. They are arguing that if the court rules against them here, then that would allow governments to deny churches things like police protection, fire protection, sewer service. You know, all these kinds of basic government services that that pretty much any organization with a building needs. And you know, one can certainly make the argument that it would be legally permissible then for a government to deny these things to churches. I can't imagine it ever happening on sheer political grounds. Who's going to vote to cut off the sewer service to the local churches? But that's the specter that they are throwing out as their great fear. The fears on the other side of this are that this will require that if the court rules in favor of the church, that will require governments to fund religious organizations through all kinds of other programs. And in particular, the school choice crowd is very invested in this. You know, if the court does rule for the church, then that makes it much easier for the school choice crowd to get the government to fund private schools in general, including a lot of those religious private schools, many of the Catholic schools that date back to the 19th century, as well as a lot of other private schools. There's a lot of Protestant private schools in the South in this country that were founded in the 1950s and 1960s as a way for white parents to avoid sending their children to integrated schools. So that's the fear that exists on the other side. Any questions about any of that? Yes?
Are there other things that would protect people from having their sewage turned off? Like, aren't people, like citizens, allowed police protection, whether or not the church itself is? Like, is there anything else that could protect them from that wouldn't have all these devastating consequences?
I think the political nature of that, like why would anyone vote through the political process to cut off police protection to anyone? I don't know that there's any other argument that one could make for a constitutional right there. You know, in general, you cannot sue the police for failing to protect you, pretty much under any circumstance. Their duty to protect people is enforceable through the political process, not through the courts in general. So I don't know that there would be another constitutional avenue to require police protection. Okay. So the other big picture of all of this is a lot of this comes down to what you see as the baseline for neutral treatment of religion. Everyone says they want the government to treat religion neutrally. Nobody agrees on what that means. So one coherent position, I think, is to say that neutral treatment of religion means no interaction. Government needs religion to do its thing. Religion needs government to do its thing. If that's the position you're going to take, under that principle, it would be perfectly legitimate to deny religion governments that are, or to deny religion benefits that the government gives to other organizations. On that principle, you would also have to have the government not regulate religion in the way that it does equivalent secular organizations, which can be problematic in itself. In a number of places, for example, religious daycares are not required to have the same ratio of adults to children that secular daycares are, and that leads to safety issues. That can lead to children being left unattended in vans that get very hot, which can be problematic. So I personally tend to think that we should want government regulating religion in the same ways that it regulates equivalent secular activities. The other principle baseline that I can see is to say that the government should treat religion the same way it treats analogous secular entities. That would mean that, yes, you can regulate religion, just like you regulate analogous secular entities. That would also require one to fund, or require the government to give benefits to religion on the same terms as it gives money and other benefits to other analogous secular organizations. As far as I can tell, none of the big advocacy organizations on either side of this consistently align with either baseline. Organizations like the Alliance Defending Freedom will say that religion should have all the access to benefits of secular organizations, but none of the regulations. Whereas a lot of the organizations on the church-state side will say that religion should not have access to any of the benefits that go to secular organizations, but should be subject to all of the regulations that secular organizations are subject to. I don't know of a principle that would justify either of those positions. It looks to me like everybody's a hypocrite on every side of this. But that's where the law and the institutions are on these things. So that's all I have. Does anyone have questions, or should we just move to discussion at this point? Okay, let's circle up and discuss.